The constitutionality of the Electoral Amendment Act will take centre stage at the Constitutional Court on Tuesday. This as the Apex Court will hear applications from the Independent Candidates Association of South Africa and the One SA movement on an urgent basis. The Electoral Act was amended to allow for independent candidates to contest national and provincial elections. SABC News reporter Ken Mapanga filed this report.
The landmark victory of the New Nation movement in the Constitutional Court paved the way for a new electoral system which will see independent candidates contest elections. When the new bill was presented for comment during the legislative process, it was open to much scrutiny.
The bill remains fundamentally flawed because it doesn't deliver an equitable electoral system. It's not an electoral system that's going to enhance accountability. It's not an electoral system that's going to give a meaningful role for independent candidates to play in our politics going forward. But that does not necessarily mean that the bill will be declared unconstitutional.
On the 17th of April 2023, President Cyril Ramaphosa signed the bill into law. Now, just months ahead of 2024, the constitutionality of the act will be tested. Despite the significant milestone, the first applicant, the Independent Candidates Association of South Africa, contends that the amendments do not level the playing field, as an independent must get more votes than a political party to gain a seat in the National Assembly. The organization will argue on several grounds that this is inconsistent with the Constitution.
When they do the seat allocation, as we know, there's 400 members of National Parliament. So what has happened is when they do the seat allocations, what we call the quota, in the past and currently, political parties to qualify only need 43,000 votes to get a seat in Parliament. The bill is written, and now the Act is written, so that for independent candidates to qualify, because it's now regions, will have to get between 77,000 votes and 93,000 votes, nearly double that of political parties.
The second applicant, the One SA movement, will make similar submissions that the Act places impermissible and arbitrary barriers to entry for independents by placing unreasonably high signature requirements on them. The organization will also argue that the Act will result in an unfair and unequal advantage for larger political parties and a disproportionate disadvantage for independents. Meanwhile, the Rivonia Circle has been admitted as a friend of the court in the matter to assist the court in making a determination. Their submissions will center on the signature requirement.
The signature requirement on unrepresented political parties and independent candidates has potential to harm our constitutional democracy and our multi-party democracy. It also introduces uneven and unequal treatment between represented parties, those parties already in the National Assembly or in provincial legislatures, and those parties who are not in those houses.
The matter is expected to proceed on Tuesday at 10 a.m. Kani Mapanga, SABC News, Johannesburg.
All right, for more, we are now joined by Angelo Fick, who is a Director of Research at the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute. A very good evening to you, sir. Thank you so very much for joining us here on SABC News.
Good evening, Ms. Ledwaba, and to your viewers.
Let's start here. I mean, which aspects, Angelo, of the Electoral Amendment Act could be at odds with the Constitution? I see that the Act, of course, is being challenged at this point, but what I found particularly interesting is that you've got smaller parties saying that it gives an unfair advantage to bigger parties, but then you've got what one could call a bigger party like the DA saying that this Act is a perversion of democracy. So you have both sides kind of arguing against this Act, but let's specifically zoom on, what could be at odds with the Constitution.
So I think in spirit, the spirit of the Constitution and the spirit of the Constitutional Court judgment was to give people access, individuals access to stand as independents and represent people, and thereby they declared the original Electoral Act unconstitutional. The particular compromise reached in this particular bill meant that the parties actually chose parties over what the spirit of that particular judgment indicated. They could have gone and taken what is our municipal electoral system, a mixed system of both candidates standing in wards or constituencies and proportional representation to make sure that it isn't just a first-past-the-post system, and adapted it to the national system. But they chose a different way, which, as these two applicants to the Constitutional Court argue, actually puts an unequal burden for representation on those who do not belong to parties, and also asks of smaller parties to do extra work that the larger parties do not have to do.
Yeah, but I mean, given the fact that this is, if one is not being represented by a bigger party, one would assume there would be, more scrutiny that is required then for an independent. Is it true to say that the Act does place, barriers for independents that, stop them or harm them from participating in the elections?
So it could be argued that part of the threshold for both signatures and for independents to stand was to prevent nuisance candidates. So we already know that the ballot paper is supposed to look rather like a telephone manual from the previous century. Yeah. And in other electoral systems, we know that nuisance candidates stand, and they sometimes sort of skew the way in which representation happens for legitimate political forces and actors. Okay. And often those nuisance candidates stand precisely to point out to what extent those established parties and the candidates for them are beholden to interests that are outside of the political representation system. But here in South Africa, I think we do need to acknowledge that we have moved some distance from 1994. Mm. And in that movement, I think we need to deepen democracy, we need to widen it, and we need to widen access to it. Okay. And that means moving beyond the chokehold that political parties have on us as voters, okay, and on the political system.
I think you anticipated what I wanted to ask you next, Mr. Fick. You talk about the need to kind of deepen a democracy, as you say it. And, some argue that there is, this urgent need for electoral reform and fair representation. So let's talk about that then. What currently is so unfair?
So as Lawson Naidu has pointed out in the piece that you've just played by your reporter, what we sit with is a situation where political parties have major control over who is in the legislature. Yeah. If you as a voter want to remove your ward councillor or a member of parliament for misconduct, there is almost no process by which you can successfully do that. However successful your representative may be, how ethical they may be, if the political party to which they belong finds that they do not play the game according to the party's needs, they can remove them by simply firing from the party, and they will then exit parliament. And we've seen those shifts happen over the last few years. Let's not forget Makosi Khoza. Let's not forget a whole bunch of other members of political parties who got removed from the legislatures because they were at odds with their parties, regardless of what the voters who voted for them or imagined that they voted for them may have felt. And here the party list system is really the problem, because to be higher up on the party list, you have to be loyal to the party. You don't necessarily have to appeal to the voters. We as voters, therefore, do not choose the people's representatives. We vote for a party, and they choose which members of their organization will be on that list. We can only make a choice based on the list to say, well, actually, we don't agree with this list, and so we'll vote for somebody else. But that's really not the best way of having accountability, which is essential in South Africa, particularly what's happened over the last 20 years. From, among other things, the arms deal fiasco, through the ARV, HIV debacle in the Mbeki years, through all of the issues that we saw in both the Ramaphosa and Zuma administrations, where Parliament simply rolled over and protected the executive. And that's really unacceptable. What we need is much more accountability to ordinary South Africans that fulfills the spirit not just of the Constitution, but of the Kliptown Charter, the Freedom Charter.
Yeah, and I know I'm moving a bit away from, to tomorrow's challenge, but I want to talk about, the fact that, some might say that our democracy is, a relatively new one. Are we, at a point yet where, we are indeed ready for independent candidates to contest nationally and provincially? And I'm just thinking about what you were talking about earlier, these, I think you said nuisance candidates. Are we at that point that we are, I think I can use the word mature enough for this sort of electoral system?
Well, cometh the hour, cometh the citizens. Yeah. Many people didn't think South Africa was ready, and South Africans were ready in 1994, and they were. Many people argued that South Africans weren't ready, capable, politically literate enough to engage the very complex balloting and sort of electoral system at the municipal level. But that turned out not to be true. So I think we need to respect South Africans enough to give them yet another challenge. People rise to challenge in this part of the world. And I think despite all of the difficulties that we have of a poor education system, compromised media, broadcasting issues around coverage of issues, social divisions, the massive inequality, I think it is important for us to deepen democracy. And I think for as long as we've had democracy on the planet, going all the way back to Greece, people have always wanted it to be qualified because those with power don't really want to give it up.
Yeah.
And parties really are very much, I think, anxious that independents are going to grab some attention away from them. Now, if you're a political party with an organization that can campaign with some funding and you're threatened by individuals who don't have that party power, organizing power and money, then that says something about you as an organization and your awareness that you are not appealing to South Africans. And the fact that many South Africans have disinvested, have shown disinterest in the political system, means that we do need to reawaken our commitment to democracy.
Yeah. A last question. I know I'm being told to wrap up here in my ear, but, and maybe I'm just, skeptical by nature, but, Mr. Fick, I look at, the fact that, we could have these independent candidates, but are they really, in the true sense, independent? I mean, the fact that there have to be funds raised for them to participate in the first place means that they're getting some funding from somewhere, means that, there's a certain agenda that perhaps they are pushing, that they are linked to something else. So are they necessarily really independent?
I think technically they would be independent of political party mechanisms and political party funding. This would have been, had the legislation been different and had the process been organized differently, a great opportunity for community organizations to get together, find a candidate, support that candidate both financially and organizationally, and catapult that candidate into a provincial or even into the national legislature. Yeah. We have seen this happen at the municipal level. There should be no reason that this shouldn't be happening at the national and provincial level. But these gates that have been put up, as these two organizations prove and argue, prevents this from happening. Ordinary people, Bushbuck Ridge, ordinary people in Makanda should be able to push. Where places have about 100,000 people living in them and 50,000 of them are voters, they should be able to get a candidate in parliament.
All right. It's always a pleasure to see you, Angelo. Thank you so much for giving us your time, sir. Angelo Fick is the Director of Research at the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute.